The Waking Tree by C. Don McCallum. Chapter 9. Disclosure. The smell of dinner wavered and sputtered in the air like a dying fly as the dishwasher began its second cycle. Darnell watched his mother slide the glass door shut, and Josephine pulled her mother's hand outside. She wanted to see the flowers before the setting sun bled away their color and all but lost their richness in the dark of night. Darnell could feel sleep coming on as he lounged on the sofa, but he pinched himself, bit his fingers at the knuckles, stomped his feet to keep himself awake. The waking state was hard with the screams and taunts of the wooden entourage on the living room walls, but in his nightmares they would unleash themselves on him again. He couldn't bear to return to the woods where the limestone, the soil, and insects all pulled at him from one side, and his own human will pulled at him from the other. He wanted to follow Abra and Josephine to go hear all about the flowers and feel the bugs on his skin, and he wouldn't hunt them this time. "I promise," he muttered. He stole a deep breath. The walls shook and laughed at his self-pity. Darnell turned back to the TV. Even the cacophonous speech and incidental noises could not cover the murmuring behind the paint on the wall. The words were inaudible, but their meaning was clear. Darnell knew the wooden man and his admonitions too well. "I'll make something out of you yet," laughed the wooden man, looming under the paint with his drowsy, slow-moving friends. Dozing, Jared rubbed his thumb on the soft, spongy arm of his blue recliner and popped the extended footrest up and down among the various positions. He stared at the TV screen, thoughtless. An hour later, he may have been able to tell someone what he watched on the screen if anyone would have asked if that person had a gun to Jared's head or a knife at his throat. Otherwise, he'd forget. He just watched the flashing lights and let the actors' talk wash over him like an ebbing tide. Jared had already heard about the flowers. He even remembered his mother planting them so many years ago in the sparse, barren soil. All of the other houses in the area, few though they were, stood even more desolate. People would often stop by the house when he was a boy just to ask what kind of flowers grew there, how she did it. Bernadine would smile wearily, push back her sweat-sticky hair and smile. "These were my mother's flowers," she'd say, pointing to the fading bearded iris and red-hot pokers. Jared and Christopher threw horse apples and watched. "These belonged to an aunt of mine." The Cannaflowers ducked their heads bashfully in front of the curious new people. Yes, Jared remembered these great bountiful bushes and barely surviving twigs suffering through another too hot summer, but somehow Bernadine always got them to live. She must have shared her secrets with Abra because the flowers were as luxuriant as ever. But Jared had grown tired of hearing about the flowers, how big they would get when they were in full bloom where they came from. They looked good and he didn't have to bother with them, so he didn't care. If anyone ever stopped to ask about them when he was away at work, he just hoped Abra had enough sense to tell them to go on. You never knew what kind of people would come around or what they really wanted. Darnell lifted his knee up on the soft, brown sofa cushion beside him and felt the velvety texture split and ripple under his fingers. No matter how many explosions, how much crime, how many loud shouting voices they witnessed on the blaring box in front of them, neither could take their minds off of Abra and Josephine on their journey around the yard on the other side of the glass. The tenderly extending fingers, smiles in awe of the beauty of Abra's, of Bernadine's flowers. Abra bent down, still holding Josephine's hand in hers, to pull an overlooked or well-concealed weed. Jared and Darnell watched the scene outside, knowing that they could never cause the trees to rejoice like they did now as these two ladies walked around the yard. Neither of them cared to notice the delicate ripples in the fanning yellow petals of the marigolds, or how small rosebuds could be when they were first making themselves known to the world around them. or the reactions of the flora and fauna to the slightest whispering wind. Darnell and Jared couldn't feel the earthworms burrowing below their feet or hear spiders laying their plans under blades of grass. Darnell and Jared preferred the artificial screams around them. No, they'd just grown accustomed to the noise, comfortable with the mindless fury of it. But both would like to be the one now holding Abra's hand and hearing the yard's history spoken just to them. During the commercial break, Jared stood and pocketed his hand. The coins of the day lay there waiting for his touch. They had heard of his routine. His fingertips had told them, "Lie low. Wait. You'll join the others tonight." The coins longed to be with their brothers. They understood how much stronger they were when they were all together in one place. The coins nodded in understanding as they shuffled there in the warm pocket throughout the day, waiting for the reunion that would soon follow. They always wished to join the others. There were rumors of some coins, dropped and forgotten, who had lain under the edges of beds, under cars and parking lots, in drainage ditches, at the bottom of vacuum cleaner bags, long ago discarded. The lone coins had learned the language of tarred streets, paint stripes, sewage and rain, dusty carpets and lint, but they always longed for the chinkle sing of the others, though they were shut away, distant and cold. Some of the coins swimming now in their pocketed brotherhood had even been in these places themselves to be picked up by a passerby. Now was the time the coins would enter Jared's drawer. They would slip into the black sock at the back in the corner, and there they would sleep and find rest together until they were needed again. But when they got into the house, they noticed something was wrong. They heard the cry an unfamiliar chant for mercy before Jared even opened the drawer. They pulled away and tried to hold onto Jared's thin pocket lining. This was a kind of desperation nothing like anything they'd heard before. Some rolled themselves from his hand, throwing themselves to the floor rather than enter the dark, imposed solitude of the drawer. "Just go quietly," said Jared's tugging fingertips. "Don't resist." He stooped to pick up the wayward coins. The coins closed their eyes, but their hands were too long gone to cover their ears from the deafening pleas from within the drawer. There was a faint smell of blood, besides, old, decayed. As alone as they may have felt, none had suffered the same kind of horrific solitude as the boy whose voice called them from this drawer, from within every piece of wood in the house. And because they were coins made of metals born deep inside the earth, they could get to the core of the story when they stilled themselves and listened. They felt the boy bleeding his life away in the drawer. In shocked silence, he half slept there for years. From within the grain of the stained wood, he watched his brother grow into a man, have his own family. He saw his mother withered with age and sorrow. Through all of the changes of weather and time, the boy droned on in an imperceptible silence until the mother, from a faded image like an old photograph, left and never came back. Her warm voice had left him alone in silence, so he shook the walls of the drawer, tinged the stained wood a deeper color of his confusion. Her voice was gone, her heart was no longer heard, and her flowers outside might try to fade. And so the coins heard the boy tell how he went searching for his mother's heartbeat. His body long gone, he squeezed himself into whatever he could walls, coins, anything that would stay still for him, let him travel to where his mama might be. The whole house shook with his sorrow, but he didn't know the languages of these new lands, and his words were often mistaken, misunderstood. Having gathered his coins, Jared picked up the sock where he kept his spare change. Empty, he stopped and stared at the sock's black limpness. "Who's been in here?" He pulled back a folded pair of socks in the corner of the drawer. He swept his fingers along the bottom of the drawer. No, he hadn't placed them into the wrong space. This wasn't a lone sock without its mate. Someone had stolen it. His money. He searched on the other side. Yes, it was gone. Darnell. Unseeing, he walked back to the living room, and Jared stared at his son, hard and fiery, a good minute before the boy couldn't look away any longer. What? Darnell sat up, annoyed and concerned. He hadn't done anything. The wooden man chuckled at Jared's side, craning his eyes through the deep coat of paint and to the side. Darnell was in trouble and he wanted to watch. Oh, I'm sure you don't know, Jared mocked, cocking his head. No, I don't. Darnell sat up straighter, putting his feet flat on the floor. Jared held the empty sock up. Something's missing. I didn't do the laundry, Darnell huffed, looking back to the television. That's not what I'm talking about, Jared yelled, slamming his hand on the wall. Abra and Josephine stopped their walk and looked. Josephine squeezed her mother's hand, afraid. Even from the other side of the yard, they knew the words being spoken. What? Darnell yelled back. It's what goes in the sock. Darnell shrugged, confused. The money. Where's my money? I don't know where it is. Darnell stiffened on the sofa, planting his feet. You don't know where it is. No. Jared stomped to the middle of the room, holding the sock up near Darnell's face. No, I don't know where it is, Darnell told him again. Well, Darnell, do you know who might know where it is? Puzzled and not meaning to implicate anyone, Darnell glanced out the glass door. He didn't know where the money was. Abra and Josephine walked and looked at their flowers again. They didn't want to give anything away. There was too much that they didn't understand. Each of them had bits and pieces of the song, but without understanding how the notes were intended to lay in relationship to the other, it couldn't be completed, comprehended. The coins had spoken to Josephine. They asked her to set them free. Jared wouldn't understand. Abra breathed in the dusk air and tried not to think of Darnell. It won't be much longer, she thought, letting her eyes rest on Josephine's face. No, it won't, the girl said, running a toe through the moist soil. Jared shouted, Oh, you think one of them took it? Darnell could see the wooden man bend over laughing. He was enjoying this. The television screamed and flashed its strobing lights at Darnell, further interrogating the boy.
I don't know where your money is. Darnell stood and ran off to his room. He slammed the door.
Jared retracted his arm and stared at the empty sock in his hand. In his pocket, the coins were already humming their fretful new tune as they found themselves being slid into the sock and into the darkness of the drawer. The clouds closed in, separating the world from the heavens. There were no stars tonight to lead Abra to the place in the woods, the place where she knew her father would come to her. Abra walked barefoot over the rocky dirt, her blue satin nightgown clinging to her thin, white legs. The limestone pushed her up and off of them, screaming at their pain, wanting the freedom of the air. There wasn't enough space to breathe tonight through the claustrophobic clouds. Bernadine watched her daughter-in-law lay under my branches, and she struggled for a breath. It had been so long since her last good one. Abra was a good mother to her grandchildren, as good as a mother could be. Abra sang to them and held them and made them smile just as Bernadine would have done if she could have been there too. Bernadine looked into Abra's mind and wept for the open, weeping wounds she saw there. Abra lifted her lithe arms, stained with bruises, and scraped the rocks from the surface of the ground with the side of her weak and wilted hands. Sometimes harsh winds had scattered those rocks, rolling them lightly or roughly to a new resting place. Sometimes it had been people or animals who assigned them to their new locations, but most of their movements over the millennia had been charted by the waters that flowed through, over, and around them. Abra was full of all of the world's destructive abilities, and they knew it. But somewhere within their petrified hearts, they could feel that if they could inhabit her, they would. Like their ancient ocean, she was peace, she was chaos, and they longed to move within her. She arranged them haphazardly in a large oval on the ground and lay down within their borders. The air pressed down on them, and she called out, "Daddy." Abra had always loved trees. She used to sit in the branches of her father's peach tree and talk to him, even after he went away for good. It seemed to Abra that her mother only knew how to scream. She didn't know how to speak softly and with love like her father did. He used to hold her close and tell her that he loved her. "More than watermelon," he'd say. "Better than ice cream," she'd ask. "Better than ice cream." Then she'd look up and smile, and he'd say, "With chocolate sauce and a cherry on top." She'd take a deep breath and swing her legs dangling off of his lap. "Better than peaches. Better than peaches and anything else that you can think of. Better than Mama." He'd look around and whisper, "Better than Mama." As much as Jesus, she could whisper too. "Yes." And they'd look up at the sky together and wonder where the moon was. Then Abra would say, "I don't want you to go away, Daddy." It was hard for her not to cry when she thought of him going down that road. Life left her eyes when she thought like that. "I know, baby," he'd say. "But Daddy's got to work so you and Mama can have lots of pretty dresses." Abra would look down at the yellow gingham that wafted in waves around her legs. "I don't really need any more dresses." But her daddy would just be looking at the road and whatever it was that pulled him out on it, away from his little girl. Abra watched the muscles in his neck rise and twist under his skin as he turned to look for the moon again. A cloud moved to reveal the pale white piece of dime in the sky as he wished. "See that abracadabra?" he asked his girl. Her eyes followed his pointing finger. She nodded, feeling his warm strength under her. "Anytime you're sad, anytime you wonder where I am, just look up at the moon and know that I'll be looking up there too." Sitting in silence, they listened to the wind play in the trees and on their own bodies, creeping in through their noses and lungs in an effort to keep them alive, hoping they could watch the unending performance. "You know why the moon's so bright?" "No," she said, unable to take her eyes off the dents and bumps of the moon's surface. "The moon reflects light from the sun. It's just like a mirror, see?" Abra nodded. "Some people think that God lives in the sun, and he uses the moon like a mirror to check up on us." This made Abra smile. Abra would feel warm for days after that. But Daddy would always go away, and he wouldn't be there to sit with, to, or tell secrets to. And Mama would yell and yell. "Daddy's little princess needs to get up, out of bed," she'd say. "Get up and get those vegetables out of that garden before all of the birds get at them. You think your daddy's going to be happy if you let all of his hard work go to waste." Her mother's breath stunk like liquor, nasty cigarettes, and putrid breath. Her hot pink claws would sink into Abra's tiny white arms, leaving angry half-moon marks. Abra would pull on her clothes and tell Tulsa, her little dolly, "I'll be back just as soon as I can." Abra would go out and pick all of the peas, cut the okra off of the stalks, always careful to avoid all the red, daddy-long-leg-looking spiders that scurried all over the place on the leaves of her daddy's plants. Those spiders scared her. She didn't trust anything with so much leg and so little to carry. She'd have to bring some of the horse apples out here to keep the spiders away. The bell peppers were pretty, though. They were her favorite to look at with their bright yellows, reds, and greens, even though she didn't much care for their taste. She took her bushels one at a time to the back porch and emptied them onto the newspaper that her mamma had laid out on the steps earlier that spring to give a cushion to the ripe vegetables before they entered the house to be eaten to serve their purpose. God's plan, God's plan, the vegetables whispered as vegetables tend to do. Abra had watched the newspaper dry and yellow under the intervals of hot summer suns, rain, and time. Every day she would emerge from the garden and twist the faucet knob and drink, pulling the stream of water into her body. She would knock on the door, and her mother came to it grinning. "May I please come in for a bite to eat, Mrs. Tilly?" "Why, yes, you may, Miss Tilly, but please clean your hands and face first before you sit at my table." Abra would go to the bathroom and run the water into the sink. Rotating the soap in her faded wash rag under the current of water, she would let the sweet scent fill her and pull the cloth up to her face. Before walking back to the kitchen for her lunch, she would step into her room to say hi to Tulsa and dab on some of the pretty cologne that her daddy had brought her. Evening in Paris, some on her wrists, maybe a little behind her ears. But one time she peeked in her room and Tulsa was in pieces. Somebody had cut her up. It wasn't just her dress that was all ripped to shreds. Abra could see all the way through to the hollow places in her doll's head and arms and legs from where someone had pulled her apart and chopped her into pieces. It wasn't long after that when her daddy wouldn't come back either. Abra had taken Tulsa to Mrs. Tilly so she could see what someone had done to her baby that her daddy had brought her special from up in Oklahoma. Half awake in a haze, Mrs. Tilly sat melting on the rough, burnt orange chair. "Well, you must have been a bad girl," she snarled, looking down at the little girl through her stupor, taking Tulsa in her hands. "No, ma'am, I've been good," Abra promised, handing her mamma the doll. "Are you sure about that, girl? 'Cause nothing like this would happen to a girl who's been doing what she's supposed to." "I've done everything you told me to," Abra wanted to say, but her mother smiled at a point just past the girl and started to doze off. Mrs. Tilly fingered the holes in the doll's legs and arms absently, then set Tulsa down to die there on her lap. The memory wafted over Abra disguised as a warm breeze now in the woods, and Bernadine sank herself in the unbreathable air around her daughter-in-law. She was her child, too, lying in this cocoon of heat and hard feelings. Without the fragile woman lying under this blanket of clouds, there would not be a Josephine to love to watch, or a Darnell to dream of holding. Her flowers would have surely died under the sun's pelting rays without Abra's kind, loving consideration. So much beauty, and all from her. Abra tried to look through the clouds to where the moon was. Bernadine wrapped all that she was around her dear daughter, her friend, and held Abra as closely as she could while thinking of how different everything would have been if only her husband hadn't gone away all those years ago. She couldn't imagine how good it would have been. She was sure of it. With only her there to raise their two boys, with Christopher's disappearance and how Jared changed, all would have been prevented, if only. Bernadine was only good at flowers and keeping her own heart beating. Sustaining the rhythms of her two boys was too much for her, so she imagined he'd never left, whatever his reason was. In her mind, he had returned safely to them all, intact and ready to continue all that their tiny family had started. He rode in the back seat of the car, criticizing her driving when she and the boys went to the store, to school, to church. He reminded her when the bills were due and told her which branches to cut from the trees to keep the pathways clear. He never dared to tell her how to manage her flowers, but he was always ready to give advice on where to get their old car fixed, whether or not the boys should be allowed to stay over at a friend's house for the night, or what to cook for dinner. He always loved her fried catfish and hot chow chow. But never had Bernadine seen her husband so angry as the time when Mr. Abbott first came knocking on their door. Right away, she knew the two men didn't get along, but Mr. Abbott would stay and talk all day if he could, and her husband stood cross-armed in the corner, watching Mr. Abbott's every move. "May I have another cup of coffee, Mrs. Lowell?" he'd ask, meekly spinning his cup on the cracked saucer. Bernadine eyed her husband, leaning up against the wall, shaking his head. "Is that pie I see?" Mr. Abbott licked his dry lips. "I don't know how long it's been since I had a slice of homemade pie." Bernadine found herself pouring coffee and cutting pie for this man. He never stopped talking long enough for her to tell him that she had to get dinner started. She would surely find herself setting another plate if she had. All the while her husband would pace, sigh, and wordlessly try to tell her something that she never quite could figure out. She wished she had paid more attention to what he was trying to say. So many things would have been different for what was left of her family. In the woods, Bernadine held Abra close and squeezed her limp, trembling body. Tiny drops fell from the sky. Abra's eyes opened. "Daddy?" she asked, puzzled by the arms she felt heavy on her body. Bernadine loosened her hold, surprised. Abra felt her presence, her love, though she mistook it for the love and touch of someone else. Her daddy's touch. Bernadine could feel a wound closing, scar tissue forming over the once oozing sore. "Yes," Bernadine whispered, running her hands through Abra's hair. She could feel the thin strands rolling, gliding under her fingertips. Raindrops slid down Abra's skin and hair, giving them a gleaming shine, chilling her a little. Bernadine lifted her long, thick hair and let it fall, tickling Abra's now shivering skin. But the words, the touch of a loved one, made her tremble more than the rain's cool embrace. For the first time in years, Abra could feel her father's touch. His voice was clear in her mind. She looked for the moon to see if she could find his face there. More drops fell, but she barely felt them, confusing them for the nervous tingling caused by the sound of her daddy's voice. It would rain now. "Do you love me like the stars?" Abra ventured. "Yes," Bernadine said, gazing into the girl's eyes. "Do you love me like doves?" Abra cried and rubbed the slight bulge on her belly. "Yes." Bernadine placed her hand on the unborn child as well. "Then where did you go?" Bernadine started and lifted herself from Abra's side. The sweet touch gone, Abra rolled over and cried onto the already muddying ground. "I do love you." Bernadine reached out again, trying out her newfound ability to touch. She wanted to use it to heal, not to do more damage. Bernadine hovered, casting a light over Abra's glistening body. Abra threw herself back and asked in between gasps, staring at the little light, "Where did you go?" Bernadine spun her consciousness to the sky, where the stars shimmered down at them both, voyeurs from a distant time. Bernadine saw the man for whom Abra cried reflected in their light of the moon, now peeking from behind the clouds. She saw Abra's daddy. He moved in circles around his daughter, trying to reach his little girl just as Bernadine had just managed to do. His love for Abra was clear, but his loss of her pained him to the point that it kept them apart, leaving him only able to gaze at her from beyond the clouds that shaded her days, within the moon that rotated around her sky. Thinking himself stuck, his fear held him back. Bernadine turned her thought back to Abra, a supplicant in the rocky mud. "I love you just like you loved Darnell." And Josephine, Bernadine told her. Abra sat up, stunned, her tears paused, and Bernadine hovered in the cleansing air in front of her, a pulsating hum of barely visible light. Bernadine let her love and Abra's daddy's love fill her. "And I'll be here, Abra, just like I have been. I will be here as long as you need me." Bernadine swirled in a colored light, orange, yellow, green, around the trees and the stream of raindrops between the twigs of a bird's nest, hopping across the power lines and bouncing up into the thick, unhappy clouds. And Abra ran, flew, grasping at the trail of rainbows that led up to the moon where her father waited. Thank you for listening to The Waking Tree by C. Don McCallum. If you're enjoying this story, please consider sharing it with someone you know. And please like the video and subscribe to this channel to help others discover these stories.